This is fine now. We're moving forward. I love technology. So I'm a former high school social studies teacher, so I don't usually use my phone. I just quickly want to go over the objectives. I'll tell you who we are, how you can find out who we are, where you can get more information about us, so we don't spend much time doing that. These are the objectives. They come right out of what we wrote in terms of the session description. This is the structure of the session that I'd like to stick us to, and I already told the presenters that I will be holding us accountable for these minutes and cutting them off when need be. So we want to give you time to talk with us in small groups and with each other to really unpack some of this work and how to make it relevant in your world and in your context, because that's the most important thing, is to put it within and think about it in your own context and have discussions about it. You can find our bios on those pages, so if you want to find out more about us or look at what we are and who we are, those are the page numbers in your booklet. I moved some slides around in the slides in front of you, and I'm skipping a bunch of them, but you have all the information on the slides, and the same, all those slides will be online, so you can borrow, steal, please, whatever you want. I've gathered them from different presentations that I've done on the Common Core, and then their slides have been from other things too, so they can give you good information. They may not be in exactly the same order. See, you're supposed to sit in front. All right, now you need your cell phones. We need to talk about what it means to be college and career ready. So, how many of you have used Poll Everywhere? Yeah, useful, free. So anytime you engage what your participants need, what students need in the classroom very quickly, it's like having those clickers with the smart boards. But this is free. So what I need you to do, if you can text and the ability to do it, you text it to the number 22333, and your choice is that you text that number, whatever your choice is. So if you want to do an would you like us to spend more of our time giving you an overview of the Common Core? Would you like us to spend more time looking at the processes on how to investigate the content of the Common Core? Do you want to spend time in small groups discussing, looking at the Common Core? Or do you really want to spend some time really talking in small groups about what does this mean for your work? What does the Common Core mean for us? How are you going to implement it? What are you talking about in your district? And how is it going to impact your state work? So those are your 4 choices. Look at that. And we'll do one more poll later, but we will spend a majority of our time on those first ones. Sorry, guys. All right, so it's polleverywhere.com, free. All right, so my part is to give you an overview of the Common Core. to know which part you need more information on. So let me bring it up. See how fast you can move your fingers. So, once again, how much do you know about the Common Core? So you text it to 223, and then you pick. I've never heard of them. I know they exist, but I've never read them. Your name doesn't come up in the poll, so don't worry about it. I have seen parts of one or both of them. There are two sets. There's a Common Core for math and a Common Core for English language arts, mathematics. And I have read them both cover to cover. They're highlighted, they're tagged. Look, I'm using math in my presentation. Aren't you proud of me? So we're kind of between a 2-ish, 3-ish level in terms of familiarity with the Common Core. In understanding, I've seen them, I know they exist. I know there's a thing called mathematical practices. I know English language arts now has a larger focus on informational texts, some of those big ideas. And we're going to unpack a few of those with our panel presentations in a moment. But I wanted to get a sense and to give them a sense of how in depth you need their information to go in terms of the content of the Common Core. So this is for you all to look at in terms of their familiarity with what's in the Common Core. All right, thank you. While I'm on here and sitting, which I'm not a sitter, sorry, I'm a teacher and always up. But if you don't know and you haven't seen it, the site is corestandards.org. Now see, there's difference, right? There's a Common Core organization, and then there's the Common Core, which gets confusing. But the Common Core, where you're going to find the actual text and content and a lot of supporting evidence from the CCSSO and NGA, is at the website www.corestandards.org, and that'll be on the website. Oh, seeing that, I hid that slide. All right. What are they? This is the definition. This is what they talk about when they present it from NGA, the National Dog Owners Association, the dog owners that were at the table, and then the two state school offices. Define the knowledge and skills students should have within their K-12 education careers. I want you to read these for a little bit because I think they're really important in terms of framing the rest of our discussion. They do not. My first one up there should be. It is not curriculum. Standards are not curriculum. I just actually on a blog, or it was the New York Times or Washington Post just had an article, and they called the standards and they equated it with curriculum. So the national curriculum, all these different so I immediately had to comment that standards are not curriculum. The standards are not defining how teachers teach, which becomes a big opening door for us to think about instruction and how instructional practice really has to change and what we have to think about in terms of that. It doesn't say everything, right? Fewer, clearer, higher, even though they're pretty thick. It doesn't say everything that needs to be taught. Once again, it depends on the context, the classroom, who you have in front of you. It does not define the nature of advanced work. There are higher levels. It does set a higher level of rigor at different grade levels, but it does not set the highest. And if they don't go there, that's okay, because the skills that they get, the knowledge and skills they get as a result of studying these things, they will be successful and can be. So giving them the tools. They're consistent. Expectations will be consistent. You say that to the public, somebody got an education, they're like, really? This is the first time? Yeah, we had 50 different sets of standards. Now we have 2, because Texas, you know, they have their own. They live in their own little world. Remind you, I'm from the social studies background, so their social studies world is a little lot different there too. So, you know, it gives us some commonality, common ground, which is the exciting part of actually having conversations about that. The other piece is mobility. It'll help students, which we all know and deal with all the time. Transient populations. And so transient not only between states, but between districts and buildings and so on. And clear standards will help students understand what is expected of them and allow for more self-directed learning. And for educators, Debby minds like that too. It's all about training. You really need to think about training. I like to use the word professional development more than training, but we're starting with training, getting them to delve into it. Not necessarily hardcore professional development, but maybe this first year, let's look at them. Let's talk about it. Valid assessments. We need to talk about what is being taught, how do you align it, how do you talk about assessment, what is balanced assessment. Own the how. We need to keep reminding teachers that just because there's common standards and standards out there, they aren't a checklist, right? And they aren't, you know, you just put it on the board, because that means your students are going to learn it if they see that there. That's not what it's about. It's a whole new how, and really rethinking the how, and how do we help people think through that together, and how do we collaboratively use that. And depth. Once you start delving, you know you understand depth. It's a lot deeper. And how do we help teachers and students go deeper? So the readiness, was through, trying to do my time too. So this is all on there, but it talks about why is it a big deal? Well, you know, they aren't national standards, but there's a little federal funding tied to having, you know, if you get together and have some common standards, you can get some funds. We all know that, we've heard that. More subject areas are being developed and in the works. We can talk about that if we have discussions at your table later. Just find me and I can tell you what's happening in science and social studies. I gave you the website. And now we're really going to look a little bit at both sets. Give you some time and have think through with experts that have really delved into the standards about what's in them. And then we're going to give you a big chunk of time to have discussions and we'll kind of just float around the time.
Okay, you can skip that one. Or you want to hand it to me? Okay. My name is Debbie Miller, and I'm glad to be with you today. I am one of the people that have read both sets of standards cover to cover with lots of tabs. And I started reading them when they came out in draft, and I'm not sure I understand everything yet. But I do know more about English language arts than I do math. I will tell you that. This is just a disclaimer slide that we always show, and I would like to point out to you, first of all, that there are a set of of college and career-ready standards. And those college and career-ready standards are organized around the strands of reading, writing, speaking and listening, and language. The Common Core standards for K through 12 are, oh, what did I do? Is it on there? Yeah, okay. Do you want me to just, okay, all right. The Common Core standards, K through 12, match the college and career standards. There's a one-to-one relationship there. The grade level standards are intended to be developmentally appropriate, and they also provide a staircase of a foundation from that builds from the beginning toward readiness for meeting those college and career ready standards. There are two sets of contents within the English language arts and literacy standards, and the first has to do with English language arts. There are 4 strands, again, in English language arts, and they are reading, writing, speaking and listening, and language. In high school English language arts, there are two sub-strands in the reading area, and this is a big change. The first is literature, which is typically what's focused on in high school English classes, but there is also a heavy emphasis on informational text as well. Beth, if you'll click away and something. The literacy standards focus on the subject areas of literacy in history, social studies, science, and technical subjects. In these subjects, literacy focuses on two strands, and they are reading and writing. Now I want to spend just a minute talking with you about the things that are different about these standards than many of your state standards. One of the things that's really important is that the different strands in the application in different subjects like the reading, writing, speaking and listening, and language, those are organized that way just for clarity, so you can find what you're looking for. The idea behind them is that it's an integrated model of literacy. And I'd like to read you the words, or you to take a moment to read with me, the words from the actual Common Core document. It says, although the standards are divided into reading, writing, speaking and listening and language strands for conceptual clarity, the processes of communication are closely connected as reflected throughout this document. So they're really focused on how all of these things work together to help students become literate. And so that's a really important concept as you're working at any level, whether that's state, district, school, or classroom, to understand those interrelationships. Another area of responsibility of what's different is the expectation for shared responsibility. The English Language Arts and the literacy Common Core standards for literacy are set in the context of what goes on with students developing literacy skills and knowledge to be able to meet the standards when they go to college. And so there is, again, a very direct statement of expectation in the Common Core English Language Arts and Literacy document. And it says, the standards insist that instruction in reading, writing, speaking, listening, and language be a shared responsibility within the school. The grades 6 through 12 standards are divided into two sections, one for English Language Arts and the other for history, social studies, science, and technical subjects. This division reflects the unique time-honored place of English Language Arts teachers in developing students' literacy skills, while at the same time recognizing that teachers in other areas must have a role in that development as well. Now, just be glad you're not at the elementary level, because they are expected to do everything. At least you have a separate set of standards to deal with for the subject area classes. Another area that's different is there's a strong emphasis on informational text. And remember that there are two sub-strands of reading even in English Language Arts, and that is literature and informational text, even within that content area. The reason for this is that informational text has a primary use in college and in career development. And so as students progress, their focus on informational text should increase. By the time they get to high school, they should be interacting with informational text at least 3/4 of the time, if not more. It also it gives an explicit acknowledgement of the importance of content area literacy, which is a big shift, because many content area teachers say, that's not my job. And I don't believe that the Common Core standards are intending that history and social studies and science and technical subject teachers are to become reading teachers or even English Language Arts teachers. But what they do expect is that those teachers know the most about how to be literate in their particular discipline, and they have a role to play. The other thing that's important and different about these standards is that in writing, there's a heavy emphasis on argument. There are 3 types of writing that are included in the Common Core standards, and they are informational writing and narrative and argument. But again, as students progress through school, they are expected to become more and more proficient and able to write arguments and explain their reasoning to the point that by the time they're in high school, 3/4 of the writing that they are expected to do should be argumentative in nature, primarily because that's what they're expected to do in college. So I'd like to give you just a little taste of what the Common Core standards look like to state standards that I just picked out of the hat. The nature of the high school English language arts and literacy standards is such that the states are going to have to interpret them. And you know that. Most of you, if you're at the state level, are heavily engaged in that right now. And you might ask, well, how much difference is there going to be between the Common Core standards and our state standards? And the answer to that is, I don't know. It really depends on the nature of your standards. But here on your left is the English Language Arts Standards, just a sample. It's from the Informational Reading Standard, and it deals with craft and structure of text. And it says that the students are to determine an author's point of view or purpose in a text, and then analyze how an author uses rhetoric in that informational text to advance the point of view or purpose of his or her writing. The state standard is kind of related to that. It's a 9th grade reading standard. And it says that students will demonstrate comprehension by identifying evidence in a variety of texts representative of different genres and using this evidence as the basis for interpretation. And then Part C of that standard says the student analyzes and evaluates the effect of language, structure, point of view, and selection of details. So they're kind of related. However, the Common Core standard is more succinct and provides a specific link between what this, stating what the student is to do and what type of analysis should take place. So in this instance, they're much more specific. Let's take a look at one more example, and that's from the history, because we do have those literacy standards that we have to pay attention to. Notice that the Common Core standards ask the student to compare points of view of 2 or more authors for how they treat the same or similar topics, including the details that they include and what they emphasize in their respective accounts. Then take a look at the state history standard, and this is from U.S. history. It asks the students to analyze the causes and consequences of the Great Depression and goes into the stock market crash and the factors that led to the Dust Bowl and explain the social and political impact of unemployment. Well, there's a big difference between what the the state standard is very content driven. The Common Core standard reflects the idea of learning to think like a historian. And not everyone teaches that way. But the great thing about learning to think like a historian is that it allows you to understand history beyond facts and events and dates. It begins to help you be a political thinker and learning to be a good citizen, as well as preparing you for doing that kind of analysis in college. So that's one way to look at the standards, is to compare your standards to what the Common Core standards say. There's another thing that's really important to do, I think, particularly in the English language arts and literacy standards, and that is looking across the strands to see what the relationships are between reading and writing and speaking and listening and vocabulary, to see what's unique in those strands or how they're related. So if you take a really quick look at the words that are in green from these standards, you'll see that in English language arts reading literature, students are asked to understand the impact of authors' word choices. And then in informational text, they're asked to know figurative, connotative, and technical meaning of words. In writing, they're asked to write about text that uses precise language and domain-specific words. And in English language arts language, they're asked to use general academic and domain-specific vocabulary. And then in history and social studies, they're asked to know domain-specific vocabulary. Science and technical subjects, again, symbols and, say it with me, domain-specific vocabulary. If I didn't mess up, that was, And then history, social studies, science and technical subjects, writing to use precise language and domain-specific vocabulary. So it's really critical to know those things. Now, the high school implications is that these are different expectations for students. And that's one thing, but the instruction for the student must change in order to allow them to reach these standards. And that means that the instruction's got to change, which means the support for your educators needs to change. Their roles are going to shift. The content of what they teach may or may not shift, but is likely to shift. Their knowledge and skills need to improve, and also their way of work needs to change because they cannot do this in isolation. It's going to require that they talk to each other and collaborate, because think about those relationships across the strands, and then just in vocabulary, all the opportunities for collaboration and reinforcement of what students are learning. And then finally, there are some ways that you can get to know the standards and build knowledge about them. I'll tell you that I've read them over and over again, and I learn something new every time I read them. So one of the first ways to start out is to look at the standard progressions, K through 12, and see how things change. See how the skills develop across the years, across the grades, and across the relationships. And then take a look at the specific content standards for either the grade or the courses that the teachers are teaching, and help them come to a better understanding of that. The standards that they're assigned, and also understanding links and relationships that other teachers might be able to make to other instruction students are receiving. And then finally, a big hint is to use the supplemental material that are in the Common Core Standards documents themselves. There are three major sources of information. One is Appendix A, where you can get more information about each strand and what the intention behind selecting the standards were. Appendix B provides you with examples of every grade level, the text that students would be expected to experience in that text, in that grade level, as well as the range of text that they would be expected to cover. And then for Appendix C, particularly for those people who are thinking of focusing on writing, this gives you grade level specific writing with rubrics. And I would suggest that you study all of those things. And so all of that needs to fold into instruction. And the thing about it is there are more questions than there are answers right now, but get involved, get knowledgeable about them, and begin digging in them. Don't expect to implement them immediately. It requires building knowledge. Beth, did we do the handout of the...
We made a resource handout because we're going green.
Right.
That we will have it online, put resources for each of these sections, and it's just a worksheet online that you can kind of put.
Yeah, it's like at a glance to help you find all the information from all the appendices and within the English Language Arts document. And there's my email address. Feel free to contact me, and I'll share what I know, limited as it may be.
Ready?
Ready, I think. So I'm Zach Foughty. I'm from the Indiana Department of Education. I'm going to walk you through a little bit of just the structure in the Common Core, some of the underlying principles in the Common Core, and comparing them to a little bit of our, taking Indiana as an example. Everybody's state standards look different, but we can generalize from Indiana to the challenges you may face, and we'll transition to Brad. He'll really focus on the, see if I can do this. Really just focus on the challenges that we'll face. So first, the Common Core, we're written with kind of two underlying principles. One is the principle of focus, and the other one's of coherence. So focus gets at the idea of, the common criticism that the U.S. standards, U.S. curriculum is a mile wide and an inch deep. So we teach a lot of everything, we cover everything, but we never really get kids to understand that at a deep level. So when they progress through, if you do a superficial understanding of algebra topics in middle school, and you get to Algebra 1, then you spend the first 9 weeks reviewing Algebra 1. And then Algebra 2 gets even worse, where you spend the first semester reviewing Algebra 1 and the second semester prepping kids for pre-calculus. And so then you try to teach some Algebra 2 content somewhere in there. So trying to get away from that, where we're going to focus on things, identify the key ideas and understandings at each grade level and course. There are things that when you look at the Common Core standards and you look at your old standards, when you do this with your teachers, they're going to say, yeah, but what about this? Right? I used to teach this, why am I not teaching that anymore? It's not that that's not an important skill for them to have. It's just not one of the most important things for them to have. And really focusing on what matters, getting kids ready for college and careers. There's a lot of great things that are good for kids to know that aren't included in here. So really just trying to focus on that. And then secondly, just taking what we need kids to know and going with a deep understanding of those. Let's not do one-step equations 1 year and then two-step and then multi-step. Let's do that all together and really get kids a deep understanding of that, so we don't have to continually review as we go through. The second one's coherence, and that's just, first of all, vertical articulation from kindergarten through 12th grade of how things fit together, making sure that topics blend into each other, and you're not just teaching something, you teach something Algebra 1 and then you don't see it again until Algebra 2 and skipping around, and I'll show you that here in a second. And then also looking within grade levels to make sure that content within that course is connected to each other. So as you look at Appendix A, which lays out high school courses, you'll see there are critical areas within those that tell you how the algebra fits with the functions, fits with the number and quantity, fits with data and statistics. So looking at K-12, how are things vertically articulated, and also how are they within grade bands? How does that content from the different domains, the different areas fit together? So I want to show you an example here. This is what the Indiana standards look like if you look at what you focus on. And I imagine it's similar in other states. So what you see is in grades K through 8, we focus on the same thing each year, right? So it's number, sense, computation, algebra, functions, geometry, measurement every year. It doesn't change. And so in your state, probably what happens is those same 5 get continued through high school and you just keep focusing on the same thing. Or you have what happens in Indiana where it gets very fragmented. So if we look at high school, and the first column is the green and the blue, and the first column is what you cover in Algebra 1. So if I were to ask you what you're going to focus on in Algebra 1, there are about 8 to 10 things that you have to focus on, which can be a little daunting as you're trying to figure out, okay, what's the most important thing? Same thing in Algebra 2, and then geometry down at the bottom. So we have this fracturing of high school where all of these things grow out of algebra and functions, and it's hard to trace things backwards. So what the Common Core does, it really focuses things where here's what it looks like in the Common Core, right? So you start in kindergarten with things, and you can clearly see where you start a focus and where you end a focus. So number and operations in base 10, we need to stop that in 5th grade, and that goes into ratios and proportions. All of that leads into the high school curriculum where we're really focusing on 5 things: in number and quantity, algebra, functions, geometry, statistics, and probability. And then we add modeling in there as well, which really transcends all of those. So really trying to get teachers to see that here are the 5 things, 6 things you need to focus on, and really everything you teach builds into these conceptual categories in one way or another. It's one of the challenges with this is this looks great on paper, but what does it actually look like once it gets implemented? So very quickly you can go from the high school, the 5 conceptual categories in high school, and you can do that. You can fragment them up all you want, so your teachers are still focusing on linear equations, linear inequalities, quadratics, and so trying to get that coherence is all about how you actually implement it, not how it's written on the standards. Indiana's a great example of that. We've had best in nation standards since 2000, yet we've still lagged behind growth on NAEP in 2000. Massachusetts, on the other hand, they've looked at instruction and they've looked at having great standards along with that, and they're blowing everybody out of the water. So it's the idea that standards aren't bad, but they're insufficient. So looking at how do they actually get implemented? How do you make sure that the two main ideas of focus and coherence come through? So one thing, strategies may be counterproductive. Thinking about what Mike Feinberg said this morning about the last story about the A to Z and the alphabet going on. Reminded me one of my favorite quotes, which is, best practices are solutions to yesterday's problems. So if we have an entire new set of standards and we try to think about, okay, how do we teach these in the past and where do we need to get? If there's misalignment between what we tried to do yesterday and what we're trying to do in the future, then maybe some of the best practices we need to reevaluate to make sure there's still best practices under the Common Core. So being very intentional about what was the goal before and what's the goal now, and going through and looking at, you may have to throw out strategies, you may have to throw out curriculum, you may have to throw out assessments and really focus on what matters. Hopefully some of that will carry over, but making sure these goals translate into practice. And the goal is coherence in curriculum, instruction, and learning. Right? The coherence in standards, you don't teach standards. Right? You're going to take the standards and they're going to translate into curriculum, instruction, and assessment. And those get implemented. So making sure that those goals get through. There's two quotes here these are two of the three main writers of the Common Core. Standards are taken as atoms, but the power is in the bonds. So as you look at individual standards, make sure that students are able to connect those together. Right? And looking at how do you build units of instruction, how do you move away from, I'm going to teach this standard today, and then tomorrow I'm going to teach something different. And getting to units, getting to learning progressions, making sure that we're teaching standards in a coherent fashion so that we transition from one thing to the next, so we don't have 180 disjoint lessons that kids never connect. And then think in chapters, not in lessons. One of the big shifts, and I know in Indiana it's this way, in Ohio it's this way, that we want people to focus on is the standards for mathematical practice. These are not necessarily new things. They've been around since the standards movement began. They've been around since NCTM started some of this back in the late 80s. But these are things that typically get ignored. They're viewed as, what you're going to do on Problem Solving Friday, or they're enrichment activities. They're things that not every kid needs to do. And we're trying to change that. So what we've said in Indiana is, if you're going to focus on one thing next year, here's what you need to focus on. Look at these mathematical practices with your teachers and talk about, how do I do these things? How do I get my kids to do these things as we move forward? So take the content that you're teaching now and start integrating these in. Build the content in as we go along and as we make this transition to the either the Park or Smarter Balanced assessments in 2014-15, but really focus on the mathematical practices. If we just change the content and we don't change what we expect students to do with the content, then we're not going to get to a good implementation of the Common Core. There's a lot of information coming out about these things, how you do that, which is on the sheet that you'll get later. So high school mathematics, they're organized into conceptual categories, which I talked about earlier. There's the 6. They're not courses. These are areas that you need to focus on. So here's how it looks, right? Geometry is a conceptual category. You have a description of what that is and some guidance. When you go into the overview, in red is a domain. So those are kind of drilling down, okay, within statistics and probability, what do we need to teach? And then we have clusters, which within clusters, then you have standards. So here's how the actual standards look. You start with a domain. Under the domain, you have a cluster of standards. So here we have those 3. The reason you teach those 3 standards is so that kids, in the end, can perform arithmetic operations with complex numbers. Each of them by themselves is a good thing to know, but if you never get to the point where kids are actually up at the cluster level and able to do that, which gets to just the bonds between the atoms, that's the goal. And then we have the standards listed there. There's a little plus by some standards. That means they're advanced and they're beyond college and career ready. You shouldn't look at those as only in a 4th-year course. If you look in Appendix A, where we have the courses laid out, some of the plus standards are included in there. That's to build coherence. So even though it may go beyond the college and career ready, you still may want to teach those to kids just so they get a fuller understanding of the standards. And I will turn this over now and hope I didn't take too much time.
Okay, so I'm Brad Findell, and happy to be here. This is, I would argue this is the most important session in the conference, because if school improvement doesn't focus on improving instruction in mathematics and ELA, oops, right? So let's try to take advantage of these college and these Common Core state standards, which push toward college and career readiness, in order to be an impetus for some of the school improvement work that you all are doing. That doesn't mean you need to start implementing the Common Core state standards next week or even next fall, but you ought to use them in order to provoke some of the discussions and the changes in instruction, and curriculum and instruction that really are necessary. So you might have the sense, by looking at sort of the organization of the standards, that it's the same old stuff in high school, but in fact, it's not. A good chunk of the high school content is now in the middle grades, and in fact, in the high school content, in what are called the conceptual categories, there are some changes. There's content that's new or has a different emphasis or different perspective, and we're going to need to figure out ways of injecting this thinking into conversation among teachers so that it can actually change curriculum and instruction. For example, number and quantity continue into the high school grades. Typically we think of number as being done, but there are some things to worry about: the distinction between rational and irrational numbers. In quantity, paying attention to units and doing what's called dimensional analysis to really think about applying mathematics to situations in science and the social sciences and everyday life. Modeling, as Zach mentioned, is threaded throughout the standards, so we need to pay attention to that. There's an unfortunate attitude in high school mathematics that we won't actually let you use this until, well, the next course or sometime much later. Well, we need to have an attitude that if it's useful to learn, we need to use it now to model things that are real to kids. So now geometry, there are unfortunately now caricatures. There are two kinds of geometry courses out there. There are the ones that, the informal geometry courses that sort of reteach middle and elementary school mathematics, just make sure kids can do real basic stuff in perimeter area and volume. And then there are the other geometry courses that try to do Euclid right and build everything up from axioms. Well, neither of those is appropriate in this day and age. All students need to prove things, but we don't need to build geometry from the ground up. So we need to push for all students proving things and base the work actually on the ideas of transformations. Algebra and functions, they are separated as different conceptual categories, and they're organized by mathematical practices in ways that are going to be unfamiliar to a lot of teachers, but actually can provide good opportunities for rethinking what the content is. And then the statistics and probability that goes way beyond what has been typically expected of all students. In fact, even a sense of statistical inference for all students. So these are big changes in high school. So believing that high school teachers know the content and are going to be just fine would be mistaken. Okay, we've got to do some change. And I would just, in order to pave the way, let me just, for some of these discussions, of course, businesses are asking students to solve interdisciplinary problems. Right? Well, what does that mean? So that would mean that in order for that to happen, we need to work across disciplines. So we need to work across ELA and science and social studies. But before that, we've got to get our algebra and geometry teachers talking to each other, folks. Right? I mean, how often do we have this attitude, look, I'm the algebra teacher and I'm the geometry? We've got to try and tie together algebra and geometry. If students need to collaborate, we need to figure out how, we need to make sure teachers collaborate. And the teachers, as we heard several speakers over the last couple of days point out, we need to now take responsibility for all students. So just a couple of points about implementation is these new standards or any new textbooks or any move to block scheduling or anything you do may or may not make any differences in student learning, because what really matters is the implementation of that idea in the school. And in fact, what we find for block scheduling or any textbook or anything, that the variation within a model is greater than the variation between models. In fact, another way to think about it is the variation within a school is often in instructional quality is often greater than the variation between schools. And another point to make about high quality professional development, and in some of these sessions you've seen points something like this. We need to focus on the content teachers are teaching. We need to draw on the curriculum materials that teachers are using. And a really good way to start is by analyzing student work. But it takes time to make these changes. And one way of thinking about these research-based principles is through this, what's called the instructional triangle, is that what really matters for learning are the interactions that take place in a classroom among the teachers, the students, and the mathematical ideas. Okay? So, I mean, that's why high-quality professional development needs to focus on the content that teachers teach so that it's influencing the way this instructional triangle operates. That's another reason why implementation matters, because if it doesn't change how these interactions happen in each classroom, it's going to miss the boat. So there are huge challenges to implementing any new idea. But in fact, right now, we've heard the phrase focus, 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 right? Well, we need to make sure, just like we've tried to focus the standards on particular content, we need to focus our school improvement initiatives so that all of this work we do can actually send us in different and unproductive directions. We've got response to intervention going on. We've got data-driven decision-making. Any of these things can be misused, and if we're trying to do all of these things at the same time, then it just leads to incoherence in the work of teaching. So I've included in here some suggestions for how to overcome some of these challenges. So please do take a look at some of those. But in high school, there are really significant challenges about deeply entrenched practices tied to particular courses and teachers' attitudes. Look, I know what the geometry course is supposed to be like. This question of Algebra 1, most people want to know, does it belong in 8th or 9th grade or 10th grade? Oh, but for my kids, it's in 7th grade, right? So it's the wrong question, because in fact, algebra begins significantly for all students in 8th grade. So the question of this Algebra 1 course isn't helpful for making the kinds of improvements that we need. And a huge part of the issue is to get the conversation started about improving curriculum and instruction is this belief in teachers' content expertise in secondary school. And I will just say that what we need to do is make the conversation safe so that we can make the atmosphere safe so that we can get the conversation started among teachers. And we have some suggestions about what districts should be doing now. The opportunities and resources are on our page of resources. And so, back to Beth.
About conversations. Thank you. And I know it felt like we went so much quickly, but as I said in the slides, we really wanted to honor time and give you time to talk to us. We have questions and so on, more on a individual basis. So what we're going to do is we're going to pose some questions to you, have discussions at your table, sitting by yourselves or kind of joining, kind of how you sit at role-specific tables, but you can obviously talk to other people too. In terms of sense of what people walk out or don't walk out with. But we won't go there right now, but that's just a strategy in case you always use strategy when you're working with adults. And I use it with kids and adults. So it's the triangle, circle, square strategy. You haven't used it, try it out. So it works for research. But what I want from you is just aha. What was an aha from today, from this particular session, or even from the whole day that will impact kind of what you're going to go, because you're leaving us soon. What are you going to go home and do? What's one thing you're going to go back and make sure that you do, or what was something you got out of the conversation with this afternoon? Yes, ma'am.
I'm gonna
Oh, say who you are and where you're from, please.
I'm Sarah Slavin, I'm from Chicago Public Schools. One thing that I really think about in our conversation here was around just the priority of how we're gonna really deconstruct what we need to construct. So thinking about the mathematical practices piece and starting to think about using existing resources that I need to just branch out even farther and not reinvent the wheel within the district, but really take resources that are already in play, that are research-based and validated and free, and leverage them in our district and within the water.
What else? Pretty good. Brain. Afternoons, like teaching 7 hours. No, for our it's not so much the brain thing. I think we all realize just how difficult. Not that we didn't move forward when we actually start having discussions with different levels. We already know kind of where your starting point is. It's like another perspective, another perspective. 13 comprehensive high school. Trying to figure out implementation plans to get the results in first year and second and third year. It's a little overwhelming. So I think that's kind of no, wow. It was a great discussion. And we wish you had more time to research. Yeah. What else? What you were doing before.
Thank you. If that wasn't working, why not start with the common to see, where we can go from there and if it is going to make an immediate impact, but to get started right away. And I truly agree with that.
We find pockets of one way or the other, but I tend to feel that. I think it's a good point. Thank you. What else? Here, there.
So we have most of our school team here, and we actually work at a middle school. And we were just talking about ensuring that teachers have this information and are guided through it and know how to navigate the standards, and collaborating to really pull together resources that we could use, and developing assessments together using the tools that are online already to help us model our assessments after them. And also just preparing our students for the technology piece is big too, because our students this year did not have a lot of exposure to working on computers, and just changing our school that way and changing the way that they're producing work. So.
I liked how Debbie mentioned, thinking like a historian, and I think Brad and Zach, kind of alluded to that too, about how, there's this shift from discrete skills to, thinking differently and applying differently, and I think that's a good, anchor for, maybe how to access the curriculum and to apply it, and that is evident, in a lot of the standards.
I like both those words, anchoring and access, right? How do we ensure access to everybody? But how do we make sure there's some anchors there in what we truly believe in and think about, and how does this all connect? right? Why? Consistently talking about why this is good for kids. Talking to everybody. Helping parents understand, helping your community understand why this, because there's going to be some shifts, test scores, all that. There's going to be a little shifting going on, and helping people consistently understand that you're doing what's best for kids. What else? Yay.
I think for us, what we all at this table realize that it is a shift not only for the students, but for the teachers. But the teachers might be the ones who have to make the biggest shift in how they conceptualize and how they structure what they need to do. And one of the things in Michigan and in our school that we looked at, because the core content expectations are almost similar to the ones in Michigan, what we started coming up with is that if you try to cover all the Huskies or whatever you want to call them, you are not going to cover them. But if you end up structuring them in some kind of standards-based unit, there's a lot of front-end work. But once you have got your units down, then it's smooth sailing, because everything, you connect everything. You look cross-curricular and see how you can connect that to, and it's just smooth sailing after that. No, I lied, it's not smooth sailing, but it's smoother. So that's one of the things that we're looking at. And when we also looked at what Georgia was doing and what they're trying to change, we sitting down here trying to wonder why. Because when you look at some of the tests, you are not asked to say, okay, 1 and 1 plus 2. How do you apply? Explain your thought process. As they say, writing is thinking in action, or thinking is writing in action, whichever way they go. And that is what the core standards are requiring all of us to do. And to have the students do that is think, write, apply, create, and everything else under the sun.
Thank you. Some wonderful reflections and wonderful thoughts. Thank you.
No. One thing our table did talk about was we're very excited, just with our own children, or, just our students and how we're teaching it. It seems to be up a level of rigor and up a level of depth that has been lacking sometimes in some of the state standards. And it's exciting to see that, there's finally going to be a challenging, rigorous curriculum that all students will, I think have the capability to pass, but, it will challenge them in ways that are going to be excellent. And really, for the future and what's going to look like in the, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, what are they going to be able to teach? What are they going to be able to pass on to their kids? It's kind of cool.
I like that thought. It's a good one. I think so, too. I'm steeped in the Common Core right now. But I think for me, what I was fighting for always as a teacher is, the collaborative time, PLCs, but, really rich things to talk about. So I think this gives us really rich things about how do we help all kids reach this level of rigor. And now we have the rigor kind of defined as much as we can for right now, but we can have these really rich discussions about that. So I'm excited about that too. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. All of our contact information is on there. And we thank our panelists.